to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today our episode is about the murder of 76-year-old Arthur Brumhill in Northampton in January 1993. Arthur was tragically attacked and murdered while he was doing the job that he loved, and despite being featured on Crime Watch a few months after his death, the case did not get any further. That was until 2015, when a man was arrested for the crime. The outcome was not what Arthur's family or the detectives in charge of the case were hoping for. This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. Northampton is a town in the East Midlands of England, located close to other cities such as Coventry, Peterborough and Nottingham. It's also not far from the Cotswolds, which is a designated area of outstanding beauty. Its proximity to lots of other amenities and locations meant that Northampton grew quite quickly, and despite still being designated a town, it is one of the largest ones with over 200,000 people living there. Arthur Brumhill lived in Northampton his entire life, and that was where he met his wife and settled down with a family. Arthur ran his own business for many years and was very successful. He has been described as a very gentle man with a great sense of humour and a love of animals. After he retired during the 1980s, he decided to follow this passion for animals and started working part-time at Denton Pet Shop on Wellingborough Road in Northampton. Wellingborough Road is a crucial thoroughfare in and out of the town, and there are many shops and businesses located there. It's reported that Arthur enjoyed working at the pet shop and was a well-known member of the community. Customers would often talk about his kind and generous manner, and said that they enjoyed visiting the shop when he was working. By 1993, Arthur was 76 years old, and still working at the shop as he had for the past 11 years. He was a reliable and trustworthy member of staff, and this was the reason in January of that year, the owners of the shop put him in charge while they went on holiday. He was to hold the fort for 2 weeks while they were away, and it was a job that Arthur took in his stride and took seriously. Arthur's case was later featured on an episode of Crime Watch, and one of the customers told the show that Arthur had said he had been working late and cashing up at the end of the day. The customer said that being told that worried her. It's unclear whether she meant because of Arthur's age or the danger that cashing up presents for a business, as often the end of the day was quite a vulnerable time, especially when working alone. Arthur appeared to have enjoyed the responsibility of running the shop. On the 21st of January, Arthur was working in the shop as usual, and the day had passed with nothing much to report. At around 5:30 p.m, Arthur got ready to close up the shop, however encountered a customer rushing in before he closed. It's documented in the Crime Watch reconstruction that the woman asked Arthur if he had any guinea pigs for sale. Arthur showed her the ones that he had, and she quickly said she would buy one. He put it in a box for the woman and she left. Arthur locked up behind her. It is then thought that he went about the other jobs that needed to be done around the shop before he could leave for the night. It was around 4 hours later, however, that a witness would spot something he thought was odd. At between 9:30 and 9:40 p.m, a man was driving down Wellingborough Road. He explained that this was a usual routine for him, however as he was driving past the pet shop, he noticed that the lights were still on. He thought that it was late for anyone to be in the shop, and as he looked closer he saw 2 men inside. One he assumed was the shopkeeper, and the other a friend or someone that he knew. He would later describe the other man to police. While he only got a fleeting look at him as he drove past, he said that the man was in his late teens, with mousy brown hair, and was around 5 feet 5 inches tall. The next day, the 22nd of January, the shop assistant at the pet shop who was due to work that day turned up. He entered the shop at around 8:30 that morning and expected Arthur to be already in. He didn't expect the sight that greeted him as he went further into the shop. As he entered the basement, he saw Arthur's body lay on the floor. He had quite clearly been attacked, and straw covered his body. The scene was gruesome and a shock for the shop assistant, who contacted the police immediately. From the outset, the police knew that they were dealing with a crime scene, and they quickly cordoned it off to preserve any evidence. Arthur's body had been beaten with an object, and it would later be found that he had 26 injuries. The perpetrator had clearly used a weapon of some sort to inflict these injuries. The first thought was that this had been a robbery and that someone wanted the cash that was on the premises. If this had been the case, the robber would have been disappointed, as only a small amount had been made that day. The awful realisation that Arthur may have been killed for only a few pounds began to set in for investigators. There was also a problem with the theory that a robber had broken into the shop, as there appeared to be no forced entry. Either the killer had entered the shop through an open door, or Arthur had perhaps let them in for whatever reason. This could also suggest that Arthur knew the killer and had let them in willingly. That was a chilling thought for the police. There was also the witness who saw two men in the shop together that night. He assumed that the men knew each other, and this may well have been connected to the murder. Police knew that Arthur had not been alone in the shop at around 9:30 p.m. Detective Superintendent Bob Thorogood later told Crime Watch that they also knew how the perpetrator had exited the shop after the murder. He explained that through examination of the shop, they found an open window upstairs. When the window was analysed, they recovered a boot print from the windowsill. This was on the outside and showed that someone had stepped onto it to get out. The boot print reportedly had quite a distinctive pattern on the tread, with some very deep grooves. It was hoped that this print may lead to whoever committed the crime. The community were astonished by the news that someone had murdered Arthur Brumhill. He was an elderly man who everyone knew to be a lovely, friendly face in the neighbourhood, and it was unthinkable that there was someone amongst them that could carry out such a terrible crime. Arthur's family were of course devastated by his loss, and were horrified that it had happened in such a violent manner. It was the community that the police now turned to for information about the day of the murder and the days before and after. Detectives did receive a large number of tips in the immediate days and weeks after the murder took place. Many of these tips came from witnesses who noticed strange occurrences or suspicious individuals in the area. A woman came forward with some information about a man she had noticed on the evening of the murder, the 21st of January, just around the corner from the pet shop. She explained on the Crime Watch episode that it was around 10:20 p.m. and she was just getting back from a night out. She got out of the car and walked across the road towards her house. As she did so, she saw a man hanging around on the street. He was looking at her intently, and she made eye contact with him. As she carried on walking to the house, she felt he was still watching her, and she turned around to find out that he was. He watched her all the way to her front door. She went in, and about 5 to 10 minutes later, she opened the door again to see if he was still there, but he had gone by that point. The man stood out to her, as he had made her feel uncomfortable. She described him as being in his early 30s, around 5 feet 10 inches tall, with short dark hair. He was also quite slim. He was wearing what was described as a road worker's jacket, which was a fluorescent yellow colour. This sighting was important because of its proximity to the shop and the strange behaviour of the man. This was not the only sighting of someone behaving strangely in the area. 2 people appeared to have spotted the same man in the streets around the shop the next day. One witness was out early, around 7:25 a.m. He noticed a man on Wellingborough Road stood awkwardly looking down the street. He said the man was almost peering down the street as though not wanting to be seen by anyone. The witness thought that he looked like he was up to no good. Around 20 minutes later at 7:45 a.m, a man was walking a couple of streets away. He told police that he was out for his morning paper, which he always did around that time. As he was walking down the road, a man was walking towards him. However, when he saw the witness, he stopped and turned back on himself as though trying to get away from him. He thought it was odd but carried on walking. At the next street, he saw the man again as he popped out from a street in front of him. This time the man saw him and looked like he threw something on the floor before walking away. The witness then stated he went into the shop and bought his paper, and this is when he saw the man a final time. As he exited the shop, he noticed he was stood touching his tracksuit top, and when the witness looked a little closer, it looked as though the man had blood on him. This was also an alarming statement. Not only had the man thrown something away, he also seemed to have blood on him. The witnesses gave a very similar description of the man. He was in his mid-30s, was between 5 feet 11 and 6 feet tall, with blonde hair. He was wearing a yellow tracksuit and looked dishevelled. It was evident that the man described from the night before and the man from the day after were not the same man, but both were of interest to police. Detective Superintendent Bob Thorogood appealed on Crime Watch for anyone with any more information about the men to come forward. He also provided the public with some other information that had been discovered over the course of the investigation. One of these pieces of information was the murder weapon used. He explained that they believed a tyre lever had been used to hit Arthur, as the injuries were consistent with this type of tool, and also there was one recorded as missing from the shop itself. Interestingly, he noted that the object seen thrown by the man the day after the murder was around the same length as the tyre lever they believed could have been used. He stated that they had been unable to find this tyre lever, and there was no sign of it amongst the rubbish in the street where the man had been. He did say that someone may have picked it up before they could get to it, and he appealed for anyone with information about such a tool, or someone who did pick it up, to contact them. Another development in the case was that the police had been sent 2 letters about the crime. However, they were anonymous. The 2 letters appeared to be from 2 different people and contained tips about potential suspects. From the excerpts shown on the episode, it was clear that the letters contained information about what these suspects or suspicious characters looked like and where they may have been or gone to. One of the letters seemed to describe that the person was wearing boots. There is not much to go on from the excerpts shown on the show, but it was clear that they were written in 2 different styles of handwriting. Detective Superintendent Thorogood explained that they were very eager to trace the authors of the mysterious letters, and hoped that they may come forward with some vital information. This was the only information that the police appeared to have, and sadly, airing Arthur's case on Crime Watch did not lead to any further information. His case began to grow cold in the months after his death, and despite the police and the public's eagerness to get it solved, nobody with relevant information came forward. Arthur's family and the community were forced to try and get on with their lives. However, what happened to him was never far from their minds. The years went by with Arthur's murder still being listed as unsolved on the Northamptonshire Police's records. These unsolved cases are re-examined by the police forces periodically, in the hope that a new breakthrough may be made. This is what happened in Arthur's case, as police took another look at the evidence. The method of investigation had changed since 1993, and although evidence was routinely collected at crime scenes at that time, it was not possible to test it in the way that is done now. By re-examining some of the evidence collected from the shop, police believed they had found some new evidence that possibly pointed to the perpetrator. It was reported in 2015 that police made an arrest 22 years after Arthur's murder. The man arrested was Stuart Jenkins, and he was 41 years old at the time of his arrest. He now lived in West Yorkshire, however had been living in Northampton at the time in 1993, when he was still a teenager. One thing that was of interest to police was that Jenkins had worked at the pet shop in 1992, when he was just 17. This was only for 6 weeks and was part of a youth training scheme. It's reported in an article by ITV that the reason he left was because he failed to impress the employer. He had also previously been spoken to about the murder and was even arrested in 1993 during the original investigation. This arrest had come about as he had allegedly told one of his friends that he had committed the murder. This information had got back to police who brought him in. He was eventually released with no charge. Since that time, Stuart Jenkins had gone on to join the army and become an army sergeant before going on to other endeavours. So why had the police now arrested him in 2015? It's reported that new evidence had been found in the form of fingerprints. As part of the re-examination, the police had looked carefully at the straw that had covered Arthur's body. The empty bag that the straw was in was found on top of a rabbit hutch close to him. When the bag was analysed, 4 fingerprints were found in the area where the perpetrator had ripped it open. When these fingerprints were checked, they found a match to Stuart Jenkins. This was enough for the police to believe they could take him to trial for the murder, as there was no apparent reason why his fingerprints would have been on that particular bag, months after he had left. It's reported that when the trial took place in 2017, James House QC worked for the prosecution. He pointed out to the jury, as reported by ITV, of particular note was the killer covered Mr. Brumhill's body with straw taken from a bag in the pet shop. A large empty bag was still present on the top of the rabbit hutch adjacent to Mr. Brumhill's body. The defendant's fingerprints have since been discovered on the bag, on the point where the bag was ripped open. He explained that 4 fingerprints were found in a line where it had been opened up. 2, he stated, belonged to Jenkins, while the other 2 were found to have inconsistent detailing to link to him. James House QC went on to tell the jury that Jenkins had actually confessed to 2 people about the murder, including a woman, saying, in the summer of 1994, Jenkins had admitted to her he was responsible for the murder of the man at the pet shop. At the time, she did not know anything about it, and she dismissed what he was saying as a foolish joke. This, the prosecution said, proved that he had confessed twice to 2 different people. Stuart Jenkins pled not guilty to the charge of murder, and in his defence, William Harbidge QC explained, it's not as simple as the prosecution are trying to make out. There are a lot of alternative explanations. There are a lot of unknowns. As reported by the BBC, when asked on the stand about his involvement, Jenkins stated he thought he got on well with Mr. Brumhill, saying, he was a nice old man, but not someone I would go and visit. He maintained that after he left in November 1992, he had not been back since, and that he could have opened the bag of straw at any time while he worked in the shop. About his confessions, he said about one of them that he did speak to a former partner about the murder, but only to say that it was scary when the police had come to speak to him about it in 1993. He added that he heard about the murder on the TV and didn't know about it before then. The defence poked holes in the prosecution's theory, discussing the fact that only 2 fingerprints on the bag could be attributed to Jenkins, and that there were other suspects in the case, including the man in the yellow tracksuit who had been seen behaving strangely the day after the murder. It was also reported that a robbery took place at another business on Wellingborough Road that same evening and could have been in some way linked to Arthur's murder. It was suggested that there were other avenues that the police could go down, and therefore Jenkins should not be the only suspect. At the end of the trial, the jury of 6 men and 6 women retired to consider the verdict. When they came to a decision, they came back to court and returned a verdict of not guilty. Stuart Jenkins was acquitted of the murder of Arthur Brumhill. The evidence had clearly not been enough to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Jenkins had anything to do with it. Stuart Jenkins told the press as he emerged from Northampton Crown Court that he was relieved by the verdict, stating, "It's been a long 2 years. It's been 2 years of not knowing where you are." His wife added, "I do hope they get justice," in relation to Arthur's family. The detectives who had been charged of the case, however, were extremely disappointed by the result. DCI Louise Hemingway, who had been in charge of the case, said, "I'm really disappointed for Arthur's family. They have waited for 24 years. There was definitely enough to bring it to trial. It was the right thing to do for Arthur, his family, and in seeking justice. This was an awful murder." If we do get any opportunities to investigate further, we will. Former Chief Superintendent Bob Thorogood, who led the original investigation, also spoke about the acquittal and the investigation. He told the BBC, "From the very start it was difficult." He went on to say they had a lack of witnesses and also said, "Added to that, we also had, in effect, too many suspects. There were quite a number of people who could have been involved, but in the end transpired not to have been." The person I feel most sorry for is Arthur's daughter, who has kept in touch with me over the years, even since I've retired, in the desperate hope that she will see justice for her father. A spokesman for Northamptonshire Police told the press, "We will never forget those people who have had their lives taken away at the hand of another, and remain committed to seeking justice in those cases that remain unsolved." Since 2017, there has been no other information about Arthur's case, and it remains unsolved. So what happened to Arthur that day? It's clear that he was attacked and killed by someone who had entered the shop to possibly rob it. Arthur appeared to have either known the person or had reason to have let them in willingly. They did not want to be seen leaving through the front door and left through a window, suggesting that they did not want to be recognised leaving through the normal entrance. There were a number of suspicious characters witnessed in the days after his murder, and sadly they were not tracked down. I completely understand why Stuart Jenkins was a suspect after the discovery of the fingerprints. He had worked at the shop and knew Arthur and the layout. However, I have to say I'm also unsure if there was enough evidence to convict him. He had only worked there a few months earlier, and his prints could have a legitimate reason for being on that bag. I also share the disappointment for Arthur's family, as they are still waiting for justice. I hope that more investigation is indeed done, and the killer can be found in the future. If you know anything about Arthur Brumhill's murder, please contact Northamptonshire Police. Thanks for listening to this episode. As always, I want to thank everyone who continues to support the podcast. Thanks to our Patreon supporters. If you're interested in supporting us on there to receive early access episodes, bonus episodes, stickers and shoutouts, use the link in the show notes. You can also support us by leaving us a review wherever you listen. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube where we have a channel. Listening and subscribing is a massive help. If you have any suggestions for cases, please let me know on social media or at my email address, theunseenpod@gmail.com. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. As always, I'm Caprice and this has been Unseen.